Welcome back, Mike G, to a show with you and me.
Well, I'm so glad I could attend. Let's begin. Let's begin. God, that was
What's that from?
Oh, geez. Well, that was Carnival 9, first impression, off of the classic and astounding Brain Salad Surgery album by progressive rock faves Emerson, Lake and Palmer, or otherwise known as the LP.
Well, did they get progress from Sergeant Pepper or what? Where did it come from?
Well, yes and no. The answer is kind of not Sergeant Pepper per se. Yes, Sergeant Pepper was hugely influential, but frankly, it actually started before Sergeant Pepper. Progressive rock has its origins in really basically two things: folk rock, but not like American folk rock. And but yeah, getting back to, and definitely the Beatles. Now I know that's a cliche for me to say. It seems like I know that every time we do one of these, I always say something began with the Beatles. Bubblegum rock started with the Beatles. Started with the Beatles, but it did. There's just no other way to say it. And here's the thing: when the Beatles did the movie Help, that's kind of when it got started, because when they did that movie, they also had the budget to do other incidental music that used a full orchestra. And that incidentally was where George Harrison first found the sitar and played a little bit on one of the tracks. So you know how Help has that little instrumental prelude, that little dramatic thing that sounds like James Bond music? That was the beginning of it. And that was attributable to George Martin, who, now I know everybody makes this cliche about the fifth Beatle, that Stu Sutcliffe was the fifth Beatle, or Billy Preston.
Wasn't Helen Reddy?
No, it was not Helen Reddy.
Okay, just checking.
Okay. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Pete Best, and it wasn't Stu Sutcliffe. It was George Martin, though. I would argue that it was George Martin, because when the Beatles got signed to EMI, it's Capitol here in the United States, but EMI was really the company. They had George Martin was basically assigned to them, and it was his job to clean them up and make them sound presentable, and he did a damn good job of it. Now, the whole thing about George Martin is George Martin had a background that wasn't just musical. See, George Martin did know how to play the piano, and as a matter of fact, he did play keyboards on some of the Beatles' earlier songs, but the thing is that he also had a background in recording radio programs for the BBC, and mostly their comedy stuff, like the Goon Show with Peter Sellers and Marty Feldman, their early stuff, and John Cleese from Monty Python, and people like that were involved. And what he got adept at doing was creating these weird sonic structures for the radio, for the conceptual weird comedy radio that they were doing. You see, English radio comedy was a lot more avant-garde than the stuff we were doing here. So he got really good at recording sound effects and things like that, and orchestras. He became adept at recording just about any kind of music, from a full orchestra to a chamber quartet and everything in between. So I would say that, the album Help has a little bit of that, but then it got into Revolver. Now, Revolver, I'm not going to say is a progressive rock album, but it certainly was a huge step in that direction. And what went on there was that the Beatles had already quit touring, so they had more time to spend in the studio. And of course, they were starting to take a lot of LSD and a lot of, smoke a lot of weed.
And Paul had died, right?
What?
And Paul had died.
Oh, supposedly.
Just kidding.
Supposedly. I think he died a little bit after that. But anyway, supposedly. But the story there is that because they had already experimented a little in the prior albums, they had more leeway and more time to record a really good album. They did that. They played around with a lot of experimental ideas, like having string quartet, like, for example, the big hit Eleanor Rigby. The reason that was such a big hit was because, or well, it's not the reason. It was a good song too, but it was one of the first songs that used a string quartet instead of drums and guitar in a pop song, and a pop song that made it to the top 40. And that was pretty remarkable. And only the Beatles could have done that back then. And then, of course, John Lennon had met Yoko Ono, and they were starting to fool around with all kinds of artistic stuff. And John Lennon uses a technique on Tomorrow Never Knows on that album called musique concrète, which was a French term that refers to tape manipulation. And there were a lot of electronic musicians prior to that were doing weird things with splicing tape together, running them backwards, running them at different speeds and all that. And so that's musique concrète. And then, of course, George Harrison did more stuff with the sitar, more Indian stuff. And so basically that then segued into Sgt. Pepper. But I think I skipped a step. Rubber Soul was the album that came out before Revolver, and Rubber Soul had already done some experimental things too. And that inspired Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys to do Pet Sounds. And when the Beatles heard Pet Sounds, they said, well, we're not going to let that goon.
It was competitive.
Yeah,
right?
It became a really weird competition back then.
And good for us, the listeners. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so we all benefited from it, really. And so as a result, as an answer to Pet Sounds, the Beatles did Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. The Rolling Stones did Satanic Majesty's Request. And the Who did some good stuff, and on and on. But if you were going to ask me the question, what is the first progressive rock album? I would say it would be Days of Future Past by Moody Blues.
Wow.
Yeah, and I know that some people think that's kind of cliche, and some would argue it's not really, it's more psychedelic, but it definitely progressive rock came from psychedelic music, but psychedelic and progressive rock are definitely two different things. Now, the other big influence that I forgot to mention is folk rock. And I don't mean the kind of folk rock that was popular in the United States, like, Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary, and I don't mean that kind of stuff. What I'm referring to is the English-speaking Commonwealth countries' interpretation of folk rock. I mean, they definitely had there were bands, like, for example, in Australia, called The Seekers, for example, very good band, and one of my favorites, that took a more English approach to folk songs. They said, well, we invented folk music. They kind of their attitude, green sleeves and stuff like that. So they started saying, well, if we combine that with rock, we'll really have something. And they did. And by the way, this video is going to be part of a playlist. And on the playlist early on is The Seekers doing a song that I think typified a trend that continued. In one of our last videos, we spoke about the freak beat scene. Well, that became the Canterbury scene. And that's where all these bands started to emerge that were based on folk music. Also blues and jazz, but I think to the mentality of the English musicians, all that stuff was gospel too. It was all American music. And they all kind of smeared it together. But then they realized, well, if we're going to do folk, we're going to do folk based on our rich history of our own English music. So you had bands like Jethro Tull, of course.
Fleetwood Mac?
Fleetwood Mac, yes. Fleetwood Mac started as a blues band, but by their third album had drifted into more folky and psychedelic stuff. Steel Eye Span, the Pentangle, Sandy Denny and Fairport Convention.
What about Led Zeppelin? Yeah.
Yes, well, Led Zeppelin I would not say was progressive rock. However, the interesting thing is they were influenced by the Canterbury scene a little bit. Sandy Denny, who was the big star of that and it became a solo artist in her own right, sang the backup on the Battle of Evermore by Led Zeppelin. And I think was an influence in some of its composition as well. So I'm going to throw Led Zeppelin in there, even though I don't really consider them a progressive rock band. But they certainly were. This is the thing, though. this is what happened in the 70s, is that, okay, so you had this thing in the 60s that was very contrived and very fusion oriented, really. It was just a fusion of rock and classical, or rock and folk, or rock and jazz, or something like that. But as you drifted into the 70s, these bands, it all cross-pollinated. Hard rock and heavy metal cross-pollinated with progressive rock. And it's kind of like the lines between them weren't as clear as they are today. Now, and I also want to talk about Germany. Now, Germany was a huge influence on progressive rock as well. In Germany, there was kind of, see, there's always these rebellions and counter-rebellions that fascinate me in the succession of musical genres. And here's a perfect example. In about the mid-60s, Germans kind of rejected English rock, or English language rock, and because it didn't, they just felt like they had more to offer, and they wanted to offer something different or something better. And as more kids were doing drugs, and just like in England or anywhere else in the 60s, they started coming up with weirder ideas. And now the Germans, of course, have a wonderful tradition of classical music, as anybody knows, but they also were very much involved in the 20th century experimental electronic thing. For example, a great composer of note is Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. And so that kind of music was a sort of an influence. Also, they were very much influenced by jazz. There was a huge free jazz movement in Germany that gave them leeway to do just about anything. And another influence on German music, from what I've read, is bands from America like Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, Captain Beefheart, and crazy stuff like that. Even the Fugs, I suppose, to a certain extent. But so they took this electronica and this sort of weird, subversive, folky ideas, and free jazz and drugs and hippie stuff and psychedelia, and swirled it all around, and it became what is kind of unfortunately called krautrock. And now,
as in sauerkraut?
No, it depends. Yeah,
I have no objections to sauerkraut.
Yeah, you and I are both German, so we probably should be sensitive to the use of that term. But unfortunately, it is a term that became prevalent in describing that music. So some of the best examples of that kind of music were bands like Ashra Temple, Popol Vuh, Tangerine Dream, Organization, Kraftwerk, and that sort of thing. And Tangerine Dream, Kraftwerk are progressive rock, but that is really a different genre. That's kind of, the krautrock thing kind of goes its own way. But it definitely was an influence on English progressive rock, and English musicians absolutely acknowledge that. As a matter of fact, even David Bowie wrote a song about Florian Schneider from Kraftwerk, because they met each other on the Trans-Europe Express and kind of, again, cross-pollinated. So
wow,
yeah,
so Germany plays a part.
Huge part.
Briefly back to England, where would the debut album from Yes fit into this mix?
Well, okay, Yes was not exactly what they started as, was not indicative of what they were going to become. Yes was a band that was very much influenced by the Beatles. And now, unlike bands like the Stones and the Moody Blues, who just wanted to create a Sgt. Pepper ripoff to cash in on the success of Sgt. Pepper, the Yes was basically a band that was influenced by them, but was not necessarily trying to be like them. The name Yes, not a lot of people know this, but the name Yes actually comes from Yoko Ono.
Wow.
Yeah, and because what it was that John Lennon went to one of Yoko Ono's art pieces. This was the day he met her, as a matter of fact. And she had this thing where you would climb up a little step ladder, and there was a magnifying glass hanging from the ceiling. And so the whole idea was you were supposed to climb up the step ladder, take the magnifying glass, and look at something on the ceiling. And what was on the ceiling was the word yes. And John Lennon loved that. He felt that was a very positive influence. He felt that was very uplifting. So that legendary story is where the band Yes got that name from. But what happened with Yes was they started to take that affirmational thing, that positive thing, to farther and farther steps. And they started writing songs that were positive affirmations, and they all went vegetarian, and they all got into Indian spirituality. And then they introduced more technical stuff. They decided that other bands were showing off their technical prowess, so would they. So Steve Howe started showing more of his guitar work. They got Rick Wakeman, and he started, doing his incredible keyboard stuff.
Did they bring in long solos?
Well, they certainly were. They certainly indulged in them, yes.
Gives you time to get some popcorn and beer.
Yeah. and of course, I would say that the first band, though, Yes came out of the psychedelic movement. Their first album came out in the late 60s, so they really weren't progressive from the beginning. But the band that was one of our favorites, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And now they came from the ashes of three things that were sort of proto-prog. Keith Emerson came from a band called The Nice. And of course, but see, The Nice was a little lopsided because he was the most talented guy in the band. His keyboarding was amazing, and those other guys were just sort of mediocre, psychedelic rock musicians. And they put out some good stuff, don't get me wrong, but The Nice was like a shoe that didn't fit him anymore. Then you had King Crimson, which of course was definitely a huge influence and definitely was really one of the first progressive rock bands, but didn't quite have a cohesive structure after a while in terms of membership. So Greg Lake, their great singer, left and joined forces with Keith Emerson. And then you had The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, which was, just weird stuff. Not necessarily prog, but certainly a lot of keyboards and stuff. The drummer from that band was Carl Palmer. And so those, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, you could imagine, only had so many albums in them, broke up, and so they got Carl Palmer. And the three of them were virtuosos, each one on his own instrument. And that's when you started to see this whole focus on musicianship and instrumentalism. And Keith Emerson would have these long classically inspired solos and did infuse music from classical, such as Rimsky-Korsakov, or was it? No, Mussorgsky, excuse me. Pictures at an Exhibition and all that stuff. Aaron Copland, Fanfare for the Common Man, and all that sort of thing. All right, but here's the thing, though. Here's what I really wanted to talk about, is that, and I'm going to be omitting a lot of great bands in this discussion, and I apologize too for that, but hopefully I can make up for it with the playlist. But there was definitely the influence in America. There were bands like Rush, Styx, Saga,
Kansas,
absolutely Kansas. Oh yeah. And, we were talking about Don Kirshner. After Don Kirshner gave up on bubblegum, Kansas was his Wunderkinds. They were his proteges, and he was the one that financed them. So ironically, the guy that created bubblegum, almost in a way, also kind of created American progressive rock too. It's really interesting that he had so much faith in them. And if you watch any of their documentaries, they talk about this. They say, look, we had one album after album that just kind of flopped, until we finally wrote a song that cut through.
He wanted a hit single.
Yeah, and
Was that Carry On Wayward Son?
It might have been, but I think Dust in the Wind was a huge one.
That was huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Point of No Return was also kind of a pretty big hit. And that kind of segues into this really weird thing that happened with progressive rock, and how it became a train wreck. The trajectory of progressive rock is fascinating, because it emerged from the psychedelic scene in England. It emerged as a rebellion, kind of, but corporate sponsored. This is the weird part about it. It was a corporate sponsored rebellion that fueled a lot of people's drug use and a lot of that thing. And then it became a mainstream thing in the 70s, and it became a staple. and hugely influential on other
Sure.
types of rock and roll and disco, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, we've talked about ELO, for example, which was basically the idea there was pretty much a straight up fusion of classical with rock. That whole thing in disco where they have the high strings,
Right.
yeah, well, that
Incorporated.
that comes from ELO. That comes from Lewis Clark, the conductor of those bands, those orchestras, who worked with ELO.
Interesting.
Yeah, and
a lot of discos, violins.
Yeah, and Walter Murphy is another guy that.
Okay.
Anyway, but I don't want
You
to
digress.
I don't want to talk about disco that much. But the point is, progressive rock was huge. It was hugely influential on so many things, and it also intermixed with glam and like the sweet.
Maybe 77.
Yeah,
that year
Queen-
might have been kind of the peak.
Queen
maybe.
was like a band that sort of was both progressive and glam, and the sweet actually kind of after the bubblegum thing and the glam rock thing kind of faded, they became kind of progressive rock too.
Right.
But here's the thing that I just find so amazing about the whole thing is that it just, when punk rock happened, a new wave, suddenly that music was all uncool. Suddenly, like the band that everybody hated.
Old geezers.
Yeah, the band that everybody was the target of punk rockers it was Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Absolutely.
But I mean, really, Emerson, Lake and Palmer was totally punk in their way. But it was like punk that could play instruments, like could actually play, And so and I mean and they talk about that. They talk about how we were doing, all the disgusting stuff the Sex Pistols were doing, but we just were better musicians, that's all. So anyway, and it's kind of weird. So,
well, when Emerson, Lake and Palmer got to the Works period,
okay.
was that like seen as indulgent, a double album?
Yes, it kind of was. That's along the lines of Yes was doing that too, and Genesis not so much, but all of those bands, Kansas was kind of guilty of that. It was starting becoming tedious, and it was getting away from music. You know what I mean? In other words, it was becoming so instrumental that they had kind of forgotten their roots in pop, in just good songwriting. So, and that's part of one of the benefits of the New Wave movement, is that it inspired these progressive rock bands who are already using a lot of keyboards and good instrumentation and good studio stuff and everything, good quality recording in the studio, to make pop music, to change their sound from that indulgent, long-winded keyboardy stuff to just concise, well-played, well-composed pop songs.
I'm thinking of Genesis, Follow You, Follow Me.
Very good example, yes.
And they segued right into pop rock new wave in the 80s.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because Genesis had done some remarkable stuff. But Peter Gabriel, who was the main influence in that band, rebelled against them. He said, look, I think he saw the writing on the wall, and he's like, I think I just want to go my own way, and that way I can focus on songs and not have to get so hung up on keyboard solos and guitar solos and 20-minute long and all that. So he came out with his first solo album, and the big hit from that was Salisbury Hill.
Awesome.
Which is an amazing song, beautiful song. And so that was kind of an indication of the beginning of the transformation of prog to a pop thing.
Right.
But as we've talked about, a lot of those bands just did not make it.
Now, ELP landed on Love Beach.
Oh my gosh!
Tell me about their experiment in the pop
music. You tell
music.
me about it. Can anybody please explain to me how do you go from something as amazing as Carnival 9 to Love Beach?
I think they were under pressure from the record company.
I think you're right. I mean, and I think it was just, God, I don't even want to talk about that. I have that album, but I tuck it away. It's like okay. Anyway, but not the whole album is not all like music like that, but still. So so this is the thing that I found fascinating is that in addition to being such a huge influence on all these other forms that I mentioned, they were also a huge influence on new wave.
Wow.
In the 80s. Because as keyboards became more of a part of the instrumentational genre of new wave and punk, well, new wave more, Yeah, they started writing stuff that was more compatible. And then, of course, MTV had a huge hand in that too. And so suddenly, these bands were streamlining themselves to be 3-minute pop songs that were good and well composed, that could be made into a video and shown on MTV. A great example.
Go ahead.
A great example of that is "On the Loose" by Saga.
Okay.
I think that's an incredible song and a very good video. Todd Rundgren's "Utopia," another example of, they really were, their early stuff was really tedious. And then but Todd Rundgren, being the songwriter, the pop songwriter that he is, realized very soon that, you needed to save the bacon of the band by just making it more of a pop band. So he was hugely influential on that transition from prog to pop.
But we must mention Carl Palmer jumping into Asia, and they seem to be
Yes.
the sound of the 80s. And
Yes.
I think he was very smart to do that.
You're absolutely right. But of course, if we're going to talk about Asia, we also have to talk about the Buggles.
Okay.
Now, see, the Buggles were an interesting band because they were the first band, in my opinion, that had their feet in both camps. They were both new wave and progressive. And when the Buggles only put out 2 albums to speak of. When the Buggles fell apart, they actually two of the 3 guys that were in the band joined Yes. I mean, go figure. I mean, that was sacrilege back then for a new wave band to do that.
Yes was in turmoil, it sounds like.
But
right?
Yes was a platform that would have been compatible with the kind of music the Buggles were doing. And they had lost huge personnel loss at that time. They lost John Anderson, and they lost Rick Wakeman and Patrick Moraz. So Jeff Downs from the Buggles played keyboards, and they actually do a Buggles song on the album Drama, but they renamed it. It's called Tempest Fugit, but it was really I Am a Camera. And interestingly enough, when Yes decided to get back together as the John Anderson version of Yes, Trevor Horn, who was the singer of Yes before, produced that big hit album they did, 90125.
It led into that.
Yeah, and he also produced Foreigner and a bunch of other stuff too. But yeah, so he was a big influence on Yes's retransformation into a more pop type band.
Mm-hmm.
But it got, there were some really bad examples. Like I think that Styx, for example. I mean,
Mr. Roboto?
Oh my God. We've already talked about that in one of our other videos, but I mean, my God. And then also stuff like bands like that you've argued, and I think effectively, that they're not even really prog bands, like Glass Tiger and doing this kind of pop stuff in the 80s, very keyboard oriented, well,
let's move up to Canada.
All right.
Tell me what's going on in Canada during this time.
Well, okay, now Canada was an example of that transition from prog to pop, and it's almost like Canadian music. Canadian rock is almost its own genre. They were hugely influenced by the success of Rush, of course. Rush was their leaders. They were basically Canada's answer to the Beatles internally. But they were not the only game in town. There were other bands in Canada.
April Wine or Triumph?
Well,
maybe?
April Wine was rock and roll.
Okay.
And Rush started as a rock and roll band. They didn't turn progressive until they hired Neil Peart as the drummer and songwriter, or lyricist. Because Neil Peart was educated in England and had a more literate background than they did. So he started writing this Tolkien-esque kind of stuff. And it just caught on like wildfire, and it influenced heavy metal, influenced so many things. But anyway, then you had another band that was trying to cash in on that too, that started as a rock and roll band, but merged into that, called Triumph. They were another threesome. In their case, less keyboard oriented. They did have keyboards, but they were less keyboard oriented. Were more focused on real guitar virtuosity from Rick Emmett. I mean, the guy was amazing. And of course, he grew beyond them too. He ended up leaving them high and dry because his capabilities were just way beyond what they were capable of doing. And then, like I said, Glass Tiger, Saga was partially influenced. They were partially Canadian. So that's really it. But I just think I just want to leave with the idea that what really ended up happening, unfortunately, was that the word progressive and the term progressive changed from a noun to an adjective. In other words, instead of it being a type of music, it became a flavor in all these kinds of music. I didn't really talk enough about jazz fusion, bands like Stanley Clarke, Return Forever to Forever, and all that, and then the Japanese band called Prism, which is a really amazing group. But that term progressive is applied to these bands like Jean-Luc Ponty, Jean-Michel Jarre. He's progressive in his playing. He's a progressive jazz player. And then there's heavy metal. Like there's progressive heavy metal like Queensryche and Dream Theater and
so it continued on in various aspects.
Yeah. It just became it sort of. I mean, okay, there still was progressive rock, but it sort of faded into the background and just became a flavor in all the types of music it influenced, and that's why we love it. It didn't just change rock music. Progressive changed music.
Well, just to end, give us like 3 albums that people, if progressive rock, 3 great albums.
Okay.
Let's just kind of end on that.
Okay, I'll go back to Moody Blues, Nights in White Satin.
Good.
Because it's an excellent use of not just orchestra, but poetry and other cheesy kind of things. But it's good, though. And see, I say that the Moody Blues were the first prog band because they stayed with it. They kept putting out albums like
That's
that.
true, yeah.
Although they did also went pop in the 80s like the other bands did. Okay.
So that's one.
That's one. Brain Salad Surgery by Emerson, Lake and
All
Palmer
right.
is
kind of young and fresh and at their peak,
and
right? Yeah.
Pretty much almost any album before 1980 by Rush.
Wow.
I think one of their best ones would be a good my favorite is Permanent Waves.
Yeah.
And Natural Science. I mean, that's prog packaged into something that's concise and edible. But it's still a long-winded 3-part song, but it's such a great song. And Closer to the Heart from the other, for Pharaoh Kings. But anyway, so those are them.
All right. Thank you, Mike G.
You're welcome.
All right. Take care.